Somewhere in Chicago, a man popped a bottle of champagne in a restaurant he couldn't really afford, celebrating the best financial decision he thought he'd ever made in his life. He didn't know that in exactly 19 days, that decision would become the single most expensive mistake of his life. He didn't know his soon-to-be ex-wife was about to become one of the richest women on the planet. And he definitely didn't know that the papers he had just rushed her to sign, the ones he pushed through before she could, in his words, figure anything out, had already stripped him of every claim he could have ever made to it. By the time he understood what had actually happened, it was already over. Not just his marriage. Everything. This is the story of Marcus Calloway, a man who thought he was winning right up until the exact moment he discovered he had already lost weeks earlier, without even realizing it. Stick with me until the end, because there's a detail in the middle of the story that changes the meaning of everything that comes after it, and if you miss it, the ending won't hit nearly as hard. Marcus Calloway was 41 years old, and by almost every visible measure, he looked like a man who had built something real. He owned a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of business that photographed beautifully on a LinkedIn profile and barely survived behind closed doors on razor-thin margins and constant refinancing. He drove a leased German sedan payment he quietly struggled to cover some months. He wore suits that cost more than what most of his employees took home in a month. And for 11 years, he had been married to a soft-spoken archivist named Elena Marsh, a woman who worked at a small historical preservation nonprofit and had never, not once in over a decade, asked him for anything beyond his time and his attention. That should have told him something about who she was. It never did. Marcus had one particular talent that never showed up on any resume, but ran underneath every relationship he'd ever had. He was extraordinarily good at making the people around him feel small enough that they stopped noticing what they actually deserved. For 11 years, Elena absorbed that talent quietly, the way dry soil absorbs water, until some days she genuinely forgot what her own worth used to feel like before she met him. He called her unambitious in front of his coworkers. He called her boring at dinner parties, always just loud enough that she could hear it from across the room. He introduced her to new clients as my wife. She does the archive thing, in a tone that somehow made the words sound like an apology for her existing at all. Elena, for reasons that will become painfully, almost unbearably clear later in this story, let him believe exactly that. She let an entire decade of people believe she was smaller than she was. But there was one name Elena almost never spoke aloud in 11 years of marriage. One piece of her past Marcus never bothered to ask a single question about, because he had already decided, long ago, that it couldn't possibly matter. Her mother's father, a man named Richard Voss. If you've never heard that name before, keep watching because you're about to understand exactly why it mattered more than anything else in this entire story. To understand how Marcus got here, you have to go back to the beginning of the marriage itself, because the pattern that ended it was baked in from almost the very first year. Marcus and Elena met at a mutual friend's engagement party, back when Marcus was 29 and still building his consulting firm out of a spare bedroom, and Elena was 26, finishing her graduate work in archival science. In those early days, by every account from people who knew them, Marcus adored her. He told anyone who would listen that Elena was the smartest person in any room she walked into. He bragged about her thesis work at parties. He seemed genuinely to see her. But somewhere around year 3, right as Marcus's business began generating real revenue for the first time, something in him shifted. Friends who watched it happen up close would later describe it as almost mechanical, the exact moment Marcus stopped needing Elena's admiration to feel important, because strangers and clients were now supplying enough of it on their own. The less he needed her validation, the less value he seemed to assign to her at all. By year 5, the comments had started. Small ones at first, the kind that could be laughed off as jokes if you squinted hard enough. By year 8, they weren't jokes anymore, and everyone around them could see it except, it seemed, Marcus himself. Elena's own sister once pulled her aside at a family barbecue and asked her directly why she put up with the way he talked to her in public. Elena's answer, which her sister would only repeat once, years later, after everything had changed, was simple. She said she was waiting. She never explained for what. 3 months before this story really begins, Marcus met a woman named Priya Deshpande at a logistics conference in Miami. Priya ran a boutique freight brokerage that was, by industry standards, wildly profitable, sharp, confident, and unattached, and more importantly to Marcus, visibly impressed by the version of himself he performed for strangers. Within 6 weeks, he had fully convinced himself that his marriage to Elena had been a starter marriage, a rehearsal for the real partnership he believed he was finally destined for. He didn't leave right away. Men like Marcus rarely do. Instead, he started building a case the same methodical way he built a business pitch, gathering justifications, rehearsing the framing he'd use with friends and family, preparing to present his own exit as something reasonable, maybe even generous on his part. He told friends Elena had let herself go, even though she looked almost exactly the same as the day he married her. He told his mother Elena had become cold and distant, even though she had spent the last 3 winters knitting sweaters for his nieces that he'd never once thanked her for giving. The first real crack in Marcus's plan appeared on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring, when Elena came home 2 hours later than usual, her eyes red, her hands trembling faintly as she set her keys down on the kitchen counter. Marcus, half scrolling through a message thread with Priya that he genuinely believed he'd hidden well enough, barely glanced up from his phone. Long day at the archive, he asked, not really asking, not really listening for the answer. Elena didn't respond right away. She sat down across from him at their kitchen table, folded her hands together the exact way she always did whenever she was studying herself for something difficult, and told him that her grandfather, a man Marcus had met exactly twice in 11 years of marriage and never once asked a real question about, had passed away that morning in a private hospice just outside of Geneva. Marcus offered the kind of condolence you'd give a co-worker whose houseplant had died. Sorry to hear that. Let me know if you need anything. He had absolutely no idea that the man Elena was quietly grieving controlled a private holding company with major stakes in maritime shipping, precious metal logistics, and commercial real estate spread across 4 continents. He had no idea Richard Voss had built that entire empire from a single freight route out of Rotterdam more than 60 years earlier, starting with nothing but a leased cargo ship and a stubborn refusal to fail. And he had absolutely no idea that Richard Voss had spent the final 2 decades of his life deliberately, quietly estranged from nearly everyone in his extended family, except for one person he had never once stopped watching from a careful, protective distance: his granddaughter, Elena. Marcus went to bed that night thinking about Priya. Elena stayed up until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at a single unanswered voicemail on her phone from a number in Zurich, because some part of her already understood that answering it would rearrange the rest of her life. If you're wondering why a woman married for 11 years never once mentioned that her own grandfather controlled a fortune worth billions, keep watching, because the answer sits at the emotional center of this entire story, and it is not the reason you're currently assuming. 2 weeks later, almost to the day, Marcus made his decision. He filed for divorce. He didn't do it quietly, and he certainly didn't do it kindly. He hired a sharp, expensive divorce attorney named Grant Whitlock and instructed him to draft the paperwork with language designed to close the door as fast and as cleanly as legally possible. Marcus's reasoning, as he explained it to Grant over a rushed lunch meeting, was almost mathematical in its cruelty. Elena had no significant assets in her own name. Elena's salary at the nonprofit was, in his exact words, basically a rounding error against his own income. And Elena, in 11 full years of marriage, had never once fought him on anything, not a vacation destination, not a career decision, not a single argument that actually went her way. So Marcus assumed, with total confidence, that she wouldn't fight him on this either. He served her the papers on a quiet Thursday morning, standing in their kitchen before either of them had finished their coffee. He didn't sit down first. He didn't soften a single word of it. He simply set the folder down on the table next to her mug and said, "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." Elena looked at that folder for a long, silent moment. Then she looked up at him, and according to what she would later tell exactly one close friend, something in his expression in that exact second made her decide, right then and there, precisely how the rest of this was going to go. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "Okay, and picked up a pen. Marcus would later describe that moment to Priya as the easiest divorce in the history of divorces. He called it a relief. He called it proof that he'd read the entire situation correctly from the very beginning, that Elena had known deep down she had nothing to offer, and had simply been waiting for permission to disappear quietly. He had absolutely no idea he was watching a woman execute a decision that would define the rest of both of their lives, and that the decision had almost nothing to do with him at all. Here's where this story really starts to turn, and I need you to pay very close attention because from this point forward, everything moves fast. Elena's compliance wasn't weakness. It was calculation, and it had been forming in her mind since the exact moment she received that voicemail from Zurich. 2 days after Marcus served the papers, Elena finally worked up the nerve to call the number back. The man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Anton Reyes, senior counsel for the Voss Family Trust, and what he told her over the next 40 minutes completely rearranged the architecture of her entire life. Richard Voss had structured his estate over nearly 15 years, with one central instruction, delivered to his legal team in writing and reaffirmed every single year, without exception, until the day he died. Everything, the shipping stakes, the real estate portfolio spanning 4 continents, the controlling interest in 3 separate holding entities, all of it, valued at just under $90 billion, would pass entirely to Elena Marsh, and only Elena Marsh, under one absolutely non-negotiable condition. The inheritance would be voided entirely, forfeited in full to a designated charitable foundation, if Elena remained legally married, at the moment the estate finalized, to anyone who had not been personally vetted and formally approved by Richard Voss while he was still alive. Marcus had never been vetted. Marcus had never been approved. Marcus, in fact, had been quietly investigated by Richard Voss's people nearly 8 years earlier, without either Marcus or Elena ever knowing it happened, and the resulting report, which Elena had never once been shown until this exact phone call, described him in 4 blunt, devastating words that Anton Reyes read aloud without softening a single syllable of them. Financially opportunistic, emotionally exploitative. Richard Voss had known exactly who his granddaughter had married. And he had spent years quietly building a fortress around his fortune specifically to guarantee that man could never touch a single cent of it, no matter how the marriage eventually ended. There was only one path forward, and the clock on it was already running. Elena needed to be fully and legally divorced, with no shared assets, no alimony claims, and no ongoing financial entanglement of any kind whatsoever, before the estate could legally transfer into her name. And it needed to happen fast, because the finalization clock had already started ticking, triggered the moment Richard Voss's will was formally entered into probate in Switzerland 3 days earlier. Elena hung up the phone that night and sat alone in the dark for almost an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Then she picked up her phone one more time and made a different call entirely, this time to a lawyer of her own choosing. Not Grant Whitlock's kind of lawyer. A different breed altogether. A quiet, meticulous estate attorney named Diane Okafor, who specialized in exactly one thing, making absolutely certain that people never lost what was never supposed to be lost. What happened over the following 9 days would determine the rest of both of their lives. But Marcus wasn't the only obstacle standing between Elena and that inheritance, and this is the part of the story almost nobody who followed it in the news ever fully understood. Richard Voss had a second grandchild, a nephew's son named Julian Voss-Aldrich, raised in London, groomed since childhood to believe he was the natural heir to the family's shipping empire. Julian had spent years building relationships with board members, cultivating an image as the serious Voss descendant, the one who showed up to shareholder dinners and learned the business from the ground floor. When word reached him, through a leak inside the trust's own legal department, that the entire estate was quietly being diverted to a cousin he'd met exactly once, at a funeral, 20 years earlier, Julian didn't take it well. Within 72 hours of that leak, Julian's own attorneys had filed a preliminary challenge to the will, arguing that Richard Voss had been of diminished mental capacity in his final years and that the estate documents naming Elena as sole heir should be frozen, pending a full competency review. It was an aggressive move and a dangerous one, because a formal legal challenge could delay the estate's finalization by months, possibly years, and every day it stayed unresolved was another day Elena remained legally married to a man who would void her entire inheritance simply by existing on a marriage certificate next to her name. Diane Okafor took that threat seriously enough to fly to Geneva herself. What she found there, after 2 days combing through decades of medical records Richard Voss had kept meticulously organized, was a folder of annual cognitive assessments commissioned voluntarily by Richard every single year for the last 12 years of his life, each one independently verified by 3 separate physicians, each one confirming full mental competency right up through the final weeks before his death. Richard Voss, it turned out, had anticipated a challenge like Julian's decades in advance. He had spent years building a paper trail specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of attack. During those 11 days, Julian's legal team also floated a second, quieter argument to a handful of reporters, one designed less to win in court and more to win in public opinion. They suggested, without ever quite saying it outright, that Elena had somehow manipulated her dying grandfather in his final, vulnerable months, timing visits and phone calls to secure her position in the will. It was a baseless accusation, and Diane Okafor shut it down within days by producing years of correspondence showing Elena had actually seen her grandfather far less than Julian had, not more, precisely because Richard Voss had deliberately kept his distance to avoid ever looking like he was buying her loyalty. But baseless accusations move fast, and for a few tense days, Elena had to sit quietly with her own name circling financial forums and comment sections, painted as a calculating opportunist by people who had never met her, while the real calculating opportunist was still 3 states away, popping champagne over what he thought was a clean getaway. Julian's case collapsed within 11 days, but not before it added an entirely new layer of urgency to Elena's situation. If the divorce from Marcus wasn't finalized before Julian's legal team found a second angle of attack, the entire inheritance could still be pulled into years of costly litigation. Let him believe, completely and without a shadow of doubt, that he is getting away with something enormous. Because the fastest, cleanest divorce in the world is always the one where nobody on the other side puts up a fight. Grant Whitlock drafted a settlement so lopsided it would have embarrassed him if anyone outside that office had ever laid eyes on it. Elena walked away with her clothes, her car, a modest joint savings account the two of them had built together over the years, and absolutely nothing else. No claim to Marcus's business. No claim to his future earnings. No spousal support of any kind, present or future. Marcus read that settlement and felt something close to euphoria. He told Priya it was almost too easy. He told his mother that Elena had finally shown some self-respect by not making a scene out of this. He signed his name with a flourish, practically giddy, on a document he genuinely believed was the final, triumphant chapter of a marriage he had already emotionally exited months earlier. He had absolutely no idea that Diane Okafor had reviewed every single clause of that agreement 3 separate times, checking and rechecking one thing, and one thing only: that nothing inside it gave Marcus any legal foothold, now or at any point in the future, to claim so much as a single cent of whatever Elena might come to own after the ink finally dried. The divorce was finalized on a Monday morning inside a downtown courthouse, in less time than it took Marcus to eat his usual lunch. He shook his own lawyer's hand out in the hallway, laughing about something unrelated. He didn't look at Elena as she walked out through the side exit. He had somewhere else to be. That same night, Marcus took Priya to dinner at the most expensive restaurant he had ever set foot inside, ordered a bottle of champagne he genuinely could not afford on his current cash flow, and raised a toast to what he called, out loud, in front of the waiter, "The best deal I've ever closed in my entire life." 6 days later, the estate of Richard Voss officially and irreversibly transferred into the sole ownership of one Elena Marsh. And Marcus Calloway found out about it from a television screen bolted above a hotel bar. He was in Miami with Priya, waiting for her to finish up a client call, half watching a business news segment scroll across a muted screen while he nursed a drink he'd already stopped tasting. The anchor was discussing an unusual story out of the global shipping and logistics world, A reclusive European magnate's estate finally settling after a lengthy, secretive probate process, $90 billion in total assets transferring to a single, previously unknown heir. Marcus wasn't really listening until the photograph appeared on screen. It took him almost 11 full seconds to process what he was actually looking at. It was Elena. His Elena. The woman he'd called boring in front of an entire dinner table. The woman he had introduced to colleagues for years as someone who does the archive thing. The woman he had just spent 9 frantic days rushing through the fastest, most one-sided divorce settlement his own lawyer had ever drafted in his career, specifically so he could move on before she figured anything out. She had already figured it out. She had figured it out before he'd even filed the paperwork. Marcus sat frozen at that bar for almost 20 full minutes, his drink going warm and untouched in his hand, his mind looping back through every single conversation from the past 2 months, hunting for the exact moment he had missed something this enormous. The voicemail from Zurich she never explained. The night she came home with red eyes and wouldn't say why beyond family stuff. The calm, almost eerie composure with which she had signed away everything without raising a single objection. She hadn't been defeated in that kitchen. She had been executing a plan he never once suspected existed. For a moment, Marcus actually laughed out loud at the bar, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound that made Priya glance over from across the room mid-call. It was the kind of laugh people make when their brain hasn't caught up to what their eyes are seeing yet. He told himself it had to be a different Elena. A coincidence. A woman who just happened to share her name and her face. He pulled out his phone and searched her name himself, fingers shaking slightly in a way he would later be embarrassed to admit to anyone. The first result was a press release from the Voss Family Trust, dated 4 days earlier, confirming the completed transfer of Richard Voss's entire estate to his sole surviving direct heir. The second result was a financial analyst's breakdown of what the transfer meant for global shipping insurance markets. The third result, the one that finally made his stomach drop through the floor of that hotel bar, was a photograph from an old regional newspaper archive, 22 years old, showing a teenage Elena standing beside an elderly man at what the caption identified as a private estate outside Zurich. The caption read simply, "Richard Voss with granddaughter, Elena." There was no mistake. There was no coincidence. There was only the slow, sickening realization that the woman he had spent 11 years dismissing as small had been sitting on a family fortune the entire time and had let him walk away from her, on his own terms, for nothing at all. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of a hotel bed while Priya slept beside him, scrolling through every article he could find, watching the number 90 billion appear over and over again next to a face he had once described, out loud, to strangers as unambitious. He called his lawyer that night in a full panic. Grant Whitlock's answer was the kind that ends careers and marriages inside the same sentence. The settlement was airtight, finalized, notarized, filed with the court. There was no reopening it. There was no renegotiating a single clause of it. Marcus had, in his own words during that very phone call, asked for the fastest, cleanest, most favorable exit possible, and Grant had delivered exactly that. It simply wasn't favorable to the person Marcus meant when he said it. Marcus spent the following days trying every angle a desperate, panicking man tries. He called Elena directly, over and over, and she never once answered. He had his lawyer draft a formal letter suggesting the settlement should be reopened given materially changed circumstances, and Diane Okafor's reply, delivered within 6 hours, was exactly 2 sentences long, and it ended that conversation permanently. He even, in a moment several friends would later describe as genuinely humiliating to witness firsthand, showed up outside the Voss Family Trust offices attempting to speak with Elena in person, only to be turned away at the front desk by security who had, as it turned out, already been given his photograph and full legal name nearly 3 weeks earlier, long before he ever set foot in that lobby. Elena had known this exact moment might come. She had prepared for it before Marcus ever realized there was anything worth preparing for. The public reaction, once financial journalists got hold of the full story, was swift and almost gleeful in its cruelty toward Marcus, though very little of that cruelty was undeserved. Reporters who dug into the paper trail found it almost too clean to believe. A man who had filed for divorce from a woman he clearly believed had nothing, structured a settlement that guaranteed she'd walk away with nothing, and then discovered, days later, that nothing had just become one of the largest personal fortunes on the entire planet. One widely shared headline called it the fastest $90 billion mistake in modern divorce history. Marcus's consulting firm, which relied heavily on his personal reputation as a sharp, savvy operator, began quietly bleeding clients within a month. Priya Deshpande, who had been perfectly content dating a man she believed was rising in the world, suddenly found herself considerably less interested in a man half the industry was now openly laughing about behind his back. She was gone by early summer, ending things over a text message shorter than the one Marcus had once used to describe Elena as boring to a friend. But the fallout didn't stop at his romantic life or his client roster. It reached into rooms Marcus never expected it to touch at all. His own mother, the same woman he had once told that Elena had become cold and distant, called him one evening in tears, not out of sympathy for him, but out of something closer to disappointment. She had liked Elena. She had always liked Elena, quietly, in a way she never fully voiced while her son was busy dismissing his own wife at every dinner. Now she sat with the same television segment Marcus had seen in Miami, watching her former daughter-in-law's photograph scroll past on a business news channel, worth more money than she could fully comprehend, and she asked her son one question he had no honest answer for. "Did you ever actually know her at all?" Marcus didn't call her back for nearly 3 weeks. Grant Whitlock, the lawyer who had drafted the settlement Marcus once called the best deal I've ever closed, found himself facing an entirely different kind of fallout. Word spread quickly through Chicago's legal circles about exactly how one-sided that divorce agreement had been, and while nothing about Grant's conduct had been improper, the story became a cautionary tale told at law firm dinners for years afterward, a reminder that a lawyer's job is to protect a client's interests as they understand them, not to protect a client from his own blind arrogance. Grant privately admitted to a colleague, months later, that he'd assumed Elena's side had simply folded because they had nothing to bargain with. He never once considered that folding might have been the strategy all along. Even Julian Voss Aldrich, the cousin whose legal challenge had briefly threatened to derail the entire inheritance, eventually reached out to Elena directly, not to apologize, but to propose a quiet business arrangement that would keep him involved in a smaller division of the shipping operations he'd spent years positioning himself around. Elena agreed to a modest advisory role for him, not out of guilt, and not out of family loyalty either, but because her grandfather's files had shown her something Julian never expected her to know, that despite everything, Richard Voss had genuinely hoped his 2 grandchildren might eventually find a way to work together, long after he was gone. It was, in its own strange way, one final instruction from a dead man who had spent his whole life orchestrating outcomes from a careful distance. Meanwhile, Elena, now stepping fully into control of an empire she had spent her entire adulthood being quietly prepared for without ever fully realizing it, discovered something in her grandfather's private files that reshaped how she understood her own marriage from the very beginning. Buried in a locked drawer of documents Anton Reyes handed over during the state transition was a folder labeled simply with her name, containing years of quiet correspondence Richard Voss had exchanged with private investigators, financial analysts, and even, on 2 separate occasions, a therapist he had consulted anonymously about how to protect a granddaughter he loved from a distance without ever overstepping into her life directly. In one letter, dated nearly 6 years earlier, Richard Voss had written a single line that Elena read over and over again the night she found it. "She will know her own worth eventually. My job is only to make sure that when she does, no one else can take it from her first." He had never once tried to warn her about Marcus directly. He had believed, correctly, that Elena needed to arrive at that truth herself, in her own time, without a wealthy grandfather she barely saw swooping in to dictate her choices. He had simply made sure that whenever that moment came, whatever she chose to do about it, she would never be financially trapped by the decision. Elena sat with that letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since the divorce, she allowed herself to cry, not out of grief for the marriage she'd lost, but out of something closer to relief, the exact feeling of finally understanding that she had never truly been alone in that house, even when it felt like it every single day for 11 years. There was one more document in that same folder, dated only 8 months before Richard Voss died, that Elena almost didn't open, because the label on it simply read, "If she ever asks why I waited so long." Inside was a single handwritten page, in the shaky script of a man well into his 80s, explaining a decision he had wrestled with for years. He wrote that he had wanted, more than once, to reach out to her directly, to warn her, to simply tell her who she was and what she was worth long before any of this became necessary. But he had watched his own sister spend 40 years married to a man who slowly hollowed her out in exactly the way Marcus was hollowing out Elena, and he had watched that same sister spend her final years insisting she'd been happy, unable to admit even to herself what had been taken from her, because no one had ever let her arrive at that truth on her own terms. Richard Voss decided, watching his granddaughter from a distance for over a decade, that he would rather protect the outcome than dictate the choice. He would make certain that whenever Elena finally saw clearly what was in front of her, nothing would be able to stand between her and walking away from it completely. Not fear. Not finances. Not a settlement designed to strip her of everything a lesser plan might have left her vulnerable to losing. It was, in the end, the only inheritance that ever really mattered to Elena. Not the $90 billion sitting in newly acquired accounts across 4 continents, but the proof, written in her grandfather's own unsteady hand, that someone had been quietly making sure she would be safe long before she ever knew she needed protecting at all. And here's the detail that makes this entire story worth remembering long after you finish watching it. Elena never once, at any point, publicly blamed Marcus for who he was. In the single statement she ever released about the inheritance, months after the story first broke, she said something that quietly explained everything about why she had let a man treat her the way he had for over a decade, and why she had let him walk away from that kitchen table believing, completely, that he had won. She said that her grandfather had spent his entire life believing that people show you exactly who they are long before the money ever arrives to prove it to everyone else. And that the kindest thing she could do for herself, after 11 years of being quietly told she was worth nothing, was to let that truth arrive entirely on its own timeline, without her ever having to argue for it, defend it, or prove it to a single soul. Marcus Calloway is still running his consulting firm today, considerably smaller than it once was, operating out of a leased office 2 floors below the one he used to occupy. He still tells the story of his divorce to anyone willing to listen, though the version he tells has changed twice now, softened at the edges, reshaped for an audience that already knows exactly how it ends. He has never spoken to Elena again, not once, not even the day a mutual acquaintance mentioned running into her at a charity gala where she'd quietly funded an entire new wing of a children's hospital without putting her own name on a single plaque. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a man like Marcus around after a story like this becomes public, and it's worth pausing on because it isn't the silence of people forgetting. It's the opposite. Former colleagues who once laughed at his jokes about Elena at those dinner parties now go quiet whenever her name comes up, unwilling to be associated with having once agreed with him, even by proxy. A former groomsman from his own wedding, a man named Devin who had known Marcus since college, admitted years later at a reunion that he'd always found the way Marcus talked about Elena uncomfortable and had simply never said anything, assuming it wasn't his place. That kind of silence, the collective silence of people who noticed and stayed quiet, is its own quiet verdict, one Marcus has had to live inside every single day since, whether anyone ever says it to his face or not. Marcus eventually remarried, 3 years after the divorce, to a woman named Renata who worked in medical device sales and knew almost nothing about his history until a friend mentioned it, almost in passing, at their engagement dinner. Renata later told her own sister that the story didn't scare her off, exactly, but it did change the way she watched him talk about people, especially people who couldn't immediately do anything for him. She said she found herself, more than once, quietly testing him, mentioning a struggling coworker or an unambitious cousin just to see how he'd respond, the way you tap a wall to check if it was hollow behind the paint. Some habits, it turned out, took longer to unlearn than a single humbling headline could fix. Elena Marsh, now widely known across financial circles by her full legal name, Elena Voss Marsh, oversees a company employing over 11,000 people across 4 continents. She rarely gives interviews. She almost never mentions her first marriage publicly. And when she does, just once, in a single line from a profile piece written about her nearly a year later, she said something that has stayed with everyone who has ever heard this story since. She said the most valuable thing her grandfather ever left her wasn't the company, and it wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the empire that now carried her name into rooms she'd never imagined entering. It was the quiet, hard-earned lesson that the people who underestimate you the most are very often the exact same people who end up teaching you, in the most painful way possible, precisely how much you are always worth. If there's one thing this story leaves you with, let it be this. The people who work hardest to convince you that you have nothing are very often the ones most afraid of what happens the day you finally realize you never needed them to see your worth in the first place. Worth was never something they could give you, and it was never something they could take away either, no matter how loudly they insisted otherwise. There's an epilogue to this story that most people never hear, because Elena never released it in any statement and never confirmed it in any interview. It came instead from a single account, given anonymously years later by someone who claimed to have worked briefly on the Voss Trust's transition team, and while it can't be verified with complete certainty, it fits everything else we know about how this story actually ended. According to that account, almost exactly 1 year to the day after the divorce was finalized, Marcus sent Elena a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual handwritten letter delivered through his lawyer's office because he had no other way to reach her anymore. In it, he apologized, or at least attempted to,